With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. There are a couple of programming updates we do have for you. Not going to be doing any shows for the rest of the week. I got to be out of town to do a guest appearance, and frankly, there's just a few bugs that we want to work out and get the studio fixed and back to the way that it should be before too long. We gained a lot of information from yesterday's test run. We're hoping to gain some from today. Just some technical issues we need to work out. We know that there's a little bit of an echo, and we're trying to work on that as well. So just bear with us as we're trying to get everything under construction. But what's great about this new studio is we're going to be able to bring you a lot more content. It's going to be a lot more convenient. And so we're hoping to get all that done pretty quickly. So the big news of today in the state of Alabama is that we have yet another person running for Alabama's Senate seat. And I got to tell you, this is turning into the Democrat presidential election. I mean, it just seems like everybody is getting into the race at this point. But John Merrill, the Secretary of State, did announce today, as I predicted yesterday, that he would be entering the race. Now, originally, I did not think that he was going to do that, but once he said that there was going to be an announcement one way or the other, I was like, okay, the only reason somebody makes an announcement like that is because they're going to get into the race. So Secretary of State John Merrill is now predicted, he is now officially in the race. And because of that, I think that it's really important that we kind of talk about how this is going to affect the field. Because we talked an awful lot yesterday about how Roy Moore getting in affects the field. Now with the field of candidates, and there may still be people that want to get in on this. There may be other people that still want to jump in. There's some people that are predicting, I think that they're wrong on this. I think that it's wishful thinking that Mo Brooks is going to sort of at the last minute jump in. I don't see that happening. But Mo Brooks did talk about the candidate that we're about to bring up, Jeff Sessions, who used to hold that seat in the Alabama Senate. There is speculation that he might get in. And Mo Brooks said, I believe it was earlier today, if not yesterday, that if Jeff Sessions were to jump in, that he would probably win the race. And I don't know if that's true. I think that unfortunately a lot of people have an unfavorable opinion of Jeff Sessions now. But I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to vote for him, honestly. I don't know if he's necessarily the best option just because if nothing else, I'd like to see somebody with some new fresh blood in there. But, we'll see. I think that there's actually a pretty good slate of candidates already. But when it comes to Jeff Sessions, I think maybe he could take the seat back, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best thing for the party or for the state of Alabama long term. And so it's possible. I don't know where Mo Brooks is getting his information. Maybe he's just going with his gut feeling, which wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world. But personally, I just don't see it happening. Maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm not saying that if Jeff Sessions were to enter the race that he wouldn't win. I'm just saying that I don't think that it would be a handed, easy victory for Jeff Sessions. Unfortunately, a lot of people feel very much jaded and skeptical of Jeff Sessions, even though they have no reason to, based on his conduct in the Trump administration, which I still say, and I'll argue point by point anybody on this, that Jeff Sessions behaved admirably as our Attorney General and should be commended for the work that he did while he was there. But some people, because the president doesn't like him and feels like he should have made a better decision, or just the other day made mention of the president's comments and said that Jeff Sessions was his biggest regret of his presidency, which is a mind-numbingly stupid thing to say, especially when you're considering, even if you're just going with cabinet appointees and people in his administration, I can rattle off 5 or 6 names just off the top of my head of people that were horrible appointments. Jeff Sessions was one of the best appointments that the president could have made. But nonetheless, he could still throw his hat in the ring. And if that comes to pass, then that makes some of the things that I'm going to say here null and void. But right now, it doesn't look like he's going to jump in. There aren't really any signs of that. So maybe, but we're just going to talk about this for the moment and assume that the slate of candidates we have is the ones that we're going to wind up with in the Republican primary. So with Merrill jumping in, I think that does alter the dynamics a little bit. I think with Merrill coming in, this thing becomes a three-man race. And I believe that those three men are John Merrill, Tommy Tuberville, and Roy Moore. Those are the three that I'm thinking probably wind up in the top tier, the top echelon of the Republican primary if that takes place. I'm guessing it's those three. Now, my reasons for that, I'll go through each one and kind of give you a brief summary and explain, because we're not going to spend a ton of time on this just because we spent so much time talking about the election yesterday. But Bradley Byrne, I think, is a phenomenal candidate. I think that if he wound up winning and went on to Washington, he'd actually be a really good senator. He's not the most conservative person from the Alabama delegation. Mo Brooks is still more conservative. You've still got Gary Palmer, I would say, is still more conservative. But when it comes down to it, he still has a very solid conservative voting record. The problem is the only people that know that are the people that are really zeroed in and paying attention to it, probably people like you and me. Because if you're here at 6 o'clock listening to a show about Alabama politics on a Tuesday night, you're probably pretty zeroed in on what's going on, and you know that Bradley Byrne has a pretty solid voting record. But the average voter doesn't know that. The average voter is not paying nearly enough attention to even know who Bradley Byrne is, much less that he has a really good, solid conservative voting record. And that's a problem for anybody, but that's especially true in Bradley Byrne's case. And the reason for that is that Bradley Byrne is going to have to fight off allegations that he's not sufficiently pro-Trump enough. And the reason for that is he was a late adopter. He was not somebody that jumped on the Trump bandwagon very early. And by the way, there have already been sort of backhanded suggestions about this from Tommy Tuberville, suggesting that Bradley Byrne, he's like, well, I was the only one that's in the field right now, when Bradley Byrne was in the field with him, that supported Trump from the very beginning. Which, by the way, was technically accurate. I'm not saying Tuberville is making a point that's unfair. But Bradley Byrne has to fight off that perception that he was not sufficiently pro-Trump enough. Not that he's anti-Trump, that he doesn't worship at Donald Trump's feet and say prayers to him every night. Because unfortunately, that becomes a liability in the Republican Party, especially in the state of Alabama now. I hate to say that, but there is a group of people that unless you worship Trump as a god, you're not sufficiently pro-Trump enough. I mean, people that believe no matter what Trump does is right, it doesn't matter how boneheaded, doesn't matter, you can't even say that the man made a mistake. There are people that, and there's a large number of these people in the state of Alabama, unfortunately. And because of that, Bradley Byrne, I think, is going to have a hard time with that. And these people gauge how conservative you are, not by how you vote, not by the policies that you hold. They think that being pro-Trump and being conservative is the same thing. So in other words, if you don't support, for example, Trump's tariffs, even though tariffs are an anti-conservative policy, even though they tend to be a big government, centralized government policy, it's because you're not conservative. If you don't support, for example, this one's going back a little ways, but if you did not support Trump's $1.5 trillion stimulus package, which was larger than President Obama's stimulus package, then you're not conservative, even though we're talking about the federal government spending $1 trillion. Somehow that's a non-conservative stance to take. And so my point in all of that is there are people that they gauge how conservative you are. They think that that's the same as saying, how pro-Trump are you? And because Bradley Byrne's not sufficiently pro-Trump in the eyes of some people, they're going to say, well, he's not really conservative, and they're not going to vote for him in this Republican primary. It's sad, but it's the truth. And then you have Arnold Mooney, who doesn't have that problem because he was a local politician. He's a representative. And so because of that, because he's only at the state level, he doesn't really have that big portfolio of being pro-Trump or anti-Trump. He doesn't have that liability that Bradley Byrne has, and he's only been in office since 2014, so he's actually relatively new. I wouldn't say that he's necessarily an inexperienced person because he's been doing this for 5 years now, but he's only held office since 2014. So he's a relative outsider, and he does have a really conservative voting record in the state. So if you're looking at his voting record in the state house, it's pretty good. The only problem is nobody knows who the man is. Now keep in mind, I do this for a living. I keep a very close watch on the movers and shakers in the House and the Senate here in the state of Alabama. Until he announced that he was running, I had no idea who he was. And I do this for a living. And a lot of that has to do with, it's not that I had never heard the name before or I'd never seen it before, but it's just it never registered with me. It was never like, oh yeah, he's somebody that's really influential in the House and Senate. And if I didn't know it, you can bet your boots that the vast majority of the people in Alabama have no idea who this guy is. And that's a real shame because if, like I said, if you look at his record, he's actually very conservative. He may be more conservative than Bradley Byrne on a lot of issues. And I think he's actually a pretty solid candidate. But unfortunately in this state, name recognition is absolutely everything. If you don't believe me, go back and look at the episode that I did directly after Election Day and went through some of the state offices. Whoever had the best name recognition won every single race. It wasn't even close. And so, unfortunately, with name recognition being such a big deal in this state, I don't think Arnold Mooney can make up that ground. I mean, he is in a field with a whole bunch of people that a lot of people know who they are. Roy Moore, John Merrill, and Tommy Tuberville have sufficient name recognition. I don't even think Bradley Byrne, honestly, has enough name recognition to win. He's got more than Mooney, but he doesn't have enough. And so, barring something weird happening, I don't think Arnold Mooney has a chance, and that's a darn shame because he may be the most conservative person in this race. But I mean, the name recognition just isn't there. If he wanted better name recognition, I guess he should have been a little bit more outspoken, a little more bombastic, somebody that got more headlines when it came to his career as a state legislature. But he didn't do that. And so here we are. Now, when it comes to Moore, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him either because, like I said, I spent so much time talking about him yesterday, and if you're interested in my opinions on that, just go back and watch yesterday's episode. But when it comes to Moore, I think that he has a devoted enough following. There are enough people that are loyal to Roy Moore that he is going to make a run of this thing. And there are a lot of people that are going to vote for him just for the revenge vote. In other words, they think that he got a raw deal in the last election because of all the stuff that was, all of the forces allied against him. And by the way, they were, and we went over those, like I said yesterday. And so he's going to get a little bit of the revenge vote, and then he also has the plurality of people that really like him and are going to vote for him basically no matter what race he's in, they're going to vote for Roy Moore. And that's not a majority, and I don't think it's enough to win him the office outright. But he does have just enough to be able to make a run of it, and I think that that's probably going to happen. That's the reason I think this stays a three-man race for a while. And, you know, the thing about it is he does have the best poll numbers. Now, granted, we don't have a poll since Merrill has jumped in the race, and that may change a little bit. I don't know that it'll change a ton, but it'll change some. But out of the very crowded field, Roy Moore has a much better following. And the thing is, the more crowded the field gets, the better things are looking for Roy Moore. John Merrill jumping in actually probably helps Roy Moore because then you have more people divided on it. The people that are in his camp are pretty loyal. They're not going to go chasing after another candidate for the most part. If they're voting for Roy Moore, it's because they absolutely want Roy Moore and nobody else. And they'll probably vote for somebody else in the general, but in the primary, if Roy Moore is in the race, they're voting for Moore. And so because of his base being very loyal, even though it's not a majority, I think he's going to be able to stay in this for a while. And then, of course, you have Tommy Tuberville. Now, Tuberville's biggest advantage is that he has almost universal name recognition. There's almost nobody in the state of Alabama that does not know who this guy is, and that's the power of being a football coach. In the state of Alabama, the football coach has more pull than most politicians. My dad and I were actually talking about this earlier, and we were joking that Nick Saban really has more power than Kay Ivey, because one of the things that he mentioned is that they had already started working on a building before the Board of Trustees at Alabama even approved it. And you know what? He's right. And the thing is, who sits on the Board of Trustees? The governor of Alabama. Can you imagine the headlines if Governor Ivey had been the deciding vote that did not give Nick Saban the building that he wanted? I mean, she would have a prayer of winning the next election if that had happened. And so even though it's weird and even though it's silly, a side effect of being a head football coach in the state of Alabama is you get virtually universal name recognition. Almost everybody knows who he is. And that is a big advantage in an election, in a statewide election. That is a massive, massive advantage. Regardless of what his policies is, whether his policies are a good idea or a bad idea, take all of that away. He already has a giant, giant advantage over all of the other people in the race with him. Now, so far his policies seem very juvenile, and he needs to come up with something a little more robust than whatever Trump goes with, that's what I want to do. Everything that Trump says, I'm going to go along with him on that. I mean, granted, it might be that it's not necessarily a bad political strategy in the state of Alabama. I'm just saying, as far as my personal preference goes, you're going to need a better answer than that. And right now, that seems to be all Tuberville has. Being pro-Trump is essentially the only thing that he has right now. And hey, you got to give it to him. The guy who is currently the governor of the state of Florida basically ran on just that. Whatever Trump says, that's what I like. And it worked out for him. He's the governor of Florida right now. I don't know that that'll necessarily work, but Alabama is significantly more pro-Trump than Florida. And so I'm not saying it's a winning strategy in and of itself, but given that the guy has universal name recognition and that he's as pro-Trump as he is, and that he's sort of beating his chest and talking about that at every opportunity, do not underestimate this guy. In fact, if I had to pick somebody that was the favorite to win, not saying this is the person I would vote for, just saying the person that I would think would probably win, right now I think it's Tuberville's to lose. I think that he is in the head of the race right now, personally. Now, and that brings us to John Merrill, who of course just announced today. Now, John Merrill is very conservative. He is very, very sharp, and if you don't believe me, listen to some of the interviews that I've done with him in the past. Or heck, even listen to interviews that he's done with other people. The guy knows his stuff. He knows his numbers. He knows his facts and statistics. Look at any of the interviews he does. He is a great interview. And if this thing does turn into a three-man race, even though I think Mooney may actually be more conservative, to be honest, the guy just doesn't have a prayer because of his bad name recognition. So I probably wind up pulling the lever for Merrill when it comes time to vote in the primaries, if we keep the slate of candidates that we've got right now. And so right now, I'd probably pick Merrill if I had to vote today. But I mean, John Merrill is an excellent choice. I think he'd be a great senator. He really knows what he's talking about. He's not afraid of anybody. And I just really like the guy on a personal level, but I also think that he would be good at the job. He's been an excellent Secretary of State so far. I mean, in the state of Alabama, where everybody talks about how horrible and restrictive our voting is because we require an ID, John Merrill made the media rounds, and there's not a single person that after talking to him could really say anything to make a decent case that Alabama was trying to suppress people's votes, especially when you're looking at his numbers. He got more votes out than any Secretary of State in history. Record-breaking turnout, specifically amongst black voters. And so I just think that he's a stand-up guy and he's good at his job. And if he brings the same kind of tenacity, the same kind of ideology to being the representative of the state of Alabama in the Senate, I'm all for that. So even though right now, if I had to guess that Merrill is probably not quite as strong a candidate as Tuberville, I would much rather have Merrill in office. And I say that as an Auburn guy and a graduate of Auburn and as a fan of Tommy Tuberville. I was mad when they fired him, honestly. But nonetheless, here we are. So, all that being said, what do I think is actually going to happen? So, as I said before, I think it turns into a three-man race. And if I had to pick, taking my own desires, my own personal feelings out of it as much as humanly possible, and just picking what I think from a political standpoint is going to happen, I think that you're going to have Roy Moore versus Tommy Tuberville in the runoff, and Tuberville winds up winning it. That's my prediction right now. Now, that runoff is a long ways away. The primary is a long ways away, and a lot can happen between now and then. Roy Moore, of all people, should know that a month, when it comes to politics, is an eternity. If you're looking at the last election and how much the political wind shifted on him, partly because of the Washington Post article and partly because of other things. But nonetheless, I say all that to say that there is a lot of time between now and then, and we'll have to see where it shakes out, but that's what I'm predicting right now. Moore versus Tuberville in the runoff. Tuberville winds up walking away with it, and if Tuberville winds up securing that nomination, I think he beats Doug Jones. To put it in baseball terms, it's a walk-off home run. I mean, it's not even close. It's out of the stadium. It's, 2 city blocks down. It's so easy. I don't think Doug Jones has a prayer if it's Tommy Tuberville. And to be honest, I think it's almost that big a crushing victory with anybody except for Roy Moore. If it winds up Doug Jones, Roy Moore, you better believe that Doug Jones is on his hands and knees praying to all the paganistic gods that he worships. That Doug Jones is on his knees praying right now, please let Roy Moore be the guy that wins the primary. Because he's the only one that even has a chance of losing to him. Everybody else, they walk into office standing up. It's not even a contest, not even close. You put Roy Moore in, maybe Moore wins. I'm not saying he absolutely loses, but he's the only one that even has a chance of losing. So I think that that's how the whole thing shakes out. That's how I see the field right now. Feel free to disagree with me if you want. You can tweet me at Tactics Radio. That's always an option. And we always love to hear your comments. I don't have a call-in line anymore because I'm not at News Radio 1440. We're looking into rectifying that. I'm not sure if I'm going to bring calls back or not, but from a technical standpoint, it's obviously a lot harder now. So I do want to mention one other thing before we move on from local news. One of the things that you may not be aware of is there was a piece done this morning about Jesse's Law, House Bill 48, and this is a phenomenal bill, I think, overall. There are a couple questions, and so the reason that I'm prefacing it by saying that I like the bill and that I like the fact that this law passed and has become law is that I think that it does a lot of good. I just have a few legal questions, and maybe my lawyer friends can help me with this, to help figure out some of the ramifications, because even good bills and even good laws sometimes have unintended consequences. And so that's the reason that I'm asking these questions here. I don't want to give off the wrong impression that I hate this bill or I think that it's a terrible bill or anything like that. No, that's not what I'm saying. If I were a member of the House or the Senate, I probably vote for it too. I'm just asking these questions. So what Jesse's Law does, House Bill 48, it terminates the parental rights of those involved in rape, incest, sodomy, or sexual assault. So there's a couple questions I have. First of all, why sodomy? And don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm a fan of sodomy. I'm just a little confused as to why it's included, just because, not that I'm a doctor, but pretty sure that can't result in a pregnancy. I mean, that's just basic anatomy. If you've had 7th grade health class, you realize that that is not something that can result in a baby being born. And so I'm not really sure why sodomy is included. Maybe they're suggesting that a rape occurred and this person was raped and then sodomized, but even then they raped someone, so wouldn't that cancel it out, and wouldn't the sodomy part be completely unnecessary? I get that this is an awkward conversation to have and it's strange. I'm just saying that I don't really understand the rationale in putting that in there. Maybe there was a good reason and I just don't know what it is, but I don't know. I see that as being a very odd thing to include in this bill. But according to a report by AL.com earlier today, Gina Miola, I think is the way to say that. Miola, yeah. Press secretary for the Alabama governor Kay Ivey said that the line terminates all parental rights of any person convicted of sexual assaulting anyone else, regardless of the victim's age or relationship to the attacker. So now this is interesting, because what it's saying is they're terminating the person's parental rights to anyone that's sexually assaulted. So if it were a creepy uncle that sexually assaulted a girl and he wound up having a relationship with that girl, then obviously, based on this law, then he no longer has parental rights to that child, which is a good thing. I think that that's a good thing to put in there. The only thing that I'm a little confused about is if he didn't rape her, like let's say that somebody, because it says regardless of the relationship to the attacker. So the only thing that I'm thinking of that might be a problem is if sexual assault is also included in this, then what's to stop a woman 6 months after she's had the baby, for example, to say, okay, yeah, we actually did have intercourse, which resulted in a pregnancy, and that was consensual, but I really don't like the fact that this guy is harassing me, and then make up a charge on sexual assault. Now, based on the way the law reads, you actually need a conviction to nullify that. But I don't know. I mean, could you theoretically, and again, maybe my friends that are lawyers are watching and have a better answer for this than I do. Could it theoretically be that a while ago there was something that could be viewed by a court as sexual assault, and even though they specifically were in a relationship and consented to having relations with one another that resulted in a child, should his parental rights still be terminated even if they did that after the alleged sexual assault happened? Because it seems to me that that could be used as sort of a trump card to hold up, and once she decides that she doesn't want to co-parent with this person anymore, and then completely terminate his parental rights. Now, if the guy's convicted of a sexual assault, even if it did happen before the consensual relationship happened, first of all, I don't know why on earth that she would be in a relationship with somebody that sexually assaulted her, but yeah, I know crazy scenarios with this do happen. And so I'm just wondering if that's something that is a good idea, because they consented to become parents after that had been not necessarily swept under the rug, but they had been able to put that aside or whatever. Again, I'm just throwing out random scenarios here, trying to see what some of the weak spots of this law would be. Maybe I'm worrying about nothing, but I would just be really interested to see if that's part of this law. And so another thing here, is this also true of the mother and the father? For example, let's say that you have a relationship where the kids are even a little bit older, and the mother is sexually assaulting the father. Is a court going to look at that mother and say, nope, you've been convicted of sexual assault, your parental rights are now null and void, and the father has full custody? I don't know. And I'm not even necessarily saying that that would be the wrong call. I'm just trying to see, are we talking about a law that would affect both parents equally, or does it only apply to the man in the relationship? Because it seems like in family law, there's an awful lot of extra scrutiny placed on the man in these situations. And I don't know that that's necessarily completely unwarranted. I'm just saying that that's something to be aware of, and I'm wondering if that is the case with this law as well. So, activists on this, some of the critics of this bill, they were critical of it for requiring a conviction to sever the rights. But here's the thing, that's the bar that you have to set. That is the bar that needs to be there, because anything short of a conviction means that just allegations that are completely unproven could be used as a way to sever your parental rights. And that's why a guilty conviction needs to be the bar that's set. Is it a high bar? Sure, it's a high bar. And what they were worried about is there are several sexual assaults or several rapes that go unreported. That is a real problem. And you can see in some of my previous episodes, I've had people specifically from organizations that deal with cases of rape. This is an issue I'm very sensitive to. But I'm just saying that if we're going to deal with parental rights and taking that away from somebody, removing their children from them, shouldn't that bar be pretty high? I mean, I want to be able to take it away from them if they're going to be harmful to the child, and I think that somebody that would be engaged in a crime like that certainly qualifies. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that shouldn't be, but I'm just saying that we need to make dead sure they actually did it. We need to make sure that they actually committed the crime that they are accused of, rather than just saying, oh, well, she says, he sexually assaulted her, and we kind of think that that's probably the case, so we're going to go ahead and take your parental rights away. No, there does need to be an actual conviction. There needs to be a legal process to go through. I mean, is it a great travesty that there may be some people that because the sexual assault or the rape or whatever crime goes unreported, that somebody's parental rights in that circumstance could be preserved? Yeah. But it would also be a huge travesty if an innocent man had his parental rights taken away for something that he didn't do because we didn't have that high bar in there. Just like the standard that we have with prison, it is better for an innocent man to walk free than a guilty man to be convicted. And so this is the reason that we have that standard of innocent until proven guilty. So I understand the concern. I'm 100% open to hearing any way that we can tighten up the screws and make sure people that actually did commit heinous crimes against humanity like this do not have their parental rights. I'm just saying that let's also look at this from the perspective of somebody that is innocent and being accused, and there is no legal process to say, no. That's why the assumption has to be innocence. Now, part of the reason that this bill has gotten an awful lot of spotlight is because there have been an awful lot of things written about Alabama recently because of the recent abortion ban. And what's really pathetic, and I'm glad that there was at least the opportunity to talk about this because this story really broke and got its legs in the past week when I didn't have any shows going on, is that the Washington Post and Alabama Media Group, which by the way is they're the ones that own AL.com. And I use AL.com as a resource. I don't hate them or have any malice towards them, but they were engaged in absolute dishonest journalism this past week. And what they were doing was they were being led around by the nose and following the lead of the Washington Post when it came to these matters. And so they were running with this narrative that in the state of Alabama, because of the new abortion ban, abortions have been completely outlawed, but a rapist still has the rights to his child. In other words, Alabama law is there in order to protect the parental rights of rapists. This is horribly, horribly incorrect for a number of reasons. And we're going to go into those right now, just to give you sort of a sampling of the kind of things that were being said. This was one of the headlines. In Alabama, where lawmakers banned abortion for rape victims, rapist parental rights are protected. Another story, this is not the headline, this is actually a part of the story. A separate story said, Alabama is one of 2 states with no statute terminating parental rights for a person found to have conceived the child by rape or incest, a fact that has gained fresh relevance since its lawmakers adopted the nation's strictest abortion ban in May. Another one wrote, while the Alabama abortion law has been challenged in court, abortion rights activists fear it could reduce access to the procedure, forcing rape victims to bear children and co-parent with their attackers. Okay, so the last one is wrong on a number of levels. First of all, even though there is if you were looking at the laws as they're on the books now, even though it probably won't go into effect because there's going to be a federal a federal court that puts a hold on it. Even if that were the case, even if you were taking that off and saying, okay, by the laws on the books in the state of Alabama, that is going to be the case, nobody is forced to parent. Before the law, after the law, that was not the case. Adoption is still a thing. If that horrible, horrible scenario were to arise, where a woman was raped by somebody, and she was worried about having to co-parent with her rapist, she still has the option of putting the child up for adoption. And if she would be somebody that would be considering abortion in the first place, I tend to think that she's somebody that would not want to raise the child anyway. So you would think that adoption would be the logical option for her. And so there's a hint of dishonesty in that part, but the truth is the whole thing's dishonest from beginning to end. Because, as we've just been talking about, this law had already passed when all of these things were written. Already passed. And so, I don't know if they just weren't doing their research and being completely lazy, or they were actively lying to people by saying that there was no law that severed the parental rights for rapists. But that's the narrative that they were running with. That's the story they were trying to spin, even though there was not an ounce of truth to it. And here's another thing. It's true that before this law passed, House Bill 48, it's true that before this law passed, there was not a specific law on the books specifically saying that the parental rights for a rapist were terminated. But that discretion was still left to the judges. The judge in Alabama still had the option of, when the evidence was presented before him, saying, yeah, we're going to terminate your parental rights. That was still within the judge's purview. And are you really going to sit there and tell me that there were not judges, that there was a judge in the state of Alabama that looks at this and says, you've been convicted of rape. Yeah, I think we can let you be a parent. No, that was not going on. And so they were trying to paint this picture of this, hokey, backward state of Alabama where, well, they really care about banning abortion, but people that rape people, they still have their parental rights, and there are still laws on the books protecting that. No, that is not the truth. They were trying to set up a false narrative to undermine support for Alabama's abortion ban. And what's really shocking is that AL.com, a group that is based in the state of Alabama, was doing everything they could to make their own state look bad. That is not the way things are here in the state of Alabama. Even before this law passed, there were not droves and droves of rapists that still had their parental rights intact. That was not happening. I'm not saying that it never happened. Obviously, this is called Jesse's Law for a reason. I'm just saying that when you're looking at it, the judges were not allowing this to go on. And in that infamous case that I think broke last year where that did happen, it was because the judge did not know that that conviction had taken place, and he immediately reversed it when he found out about it. And so let's not act as though it was a commonplace occurrence in this state, the way that the media tried to spin it. That if you raped a woman, then you had all your parental rights protected under Alabama law. And they also tried to paint this picture, sort of suggesting that Alabama lawmakers put a bill in place specifically to protect the parental rights of rapists. That didn't happen either. It was an oversight. That's all it was. This happens in law all the time. Not making excuses for it, just saying that it happens. That there's some scenario or some situation that people had not thought about, and the law didn't really cover it. It's not as though somebody put a bill into place that a bunch of Alabama lawmakers are standing around as like, you know what we really need to do? We need a bill that protects the parental rights of rapists. No, that did not happen. And that's sort of the connotation, sort of the implication that these stories were trying to suggest, and it's just not true. This was dishonest journalism from AL.com and from the Washington Post and from everybody that repeated this lie about how things are in the state of Alabama. So And really all it boils down to is they were just lying because they didn't like Alabama's abortion ban. They didn't like the abortion ban. They were trying to undermine support for it. They were trying to paint the state of Alabama and the state lawmakers in the worst light possible. And because of that, they were willing to lie about it to try to make the abortion ban seem draconian. Which, nothing could be further from the truth. I think that this is the best bill that the state of Alabama has put out in a very, very long time. And by that, I'm talking about the abortion ban, but, also the law severing the parental rights for rapists. But here's the other thing that I wanted to bring up. For those that actually thought this were true, let's just assume for the moment that this narrative were true and that the things that they were saying were accurate. Please spare me your crocodile tears. Are you really telling me that because you're so concerned for the child, that you're saying the merciful, correct thing to do would be to kill it, as opposed to let a rapist have parental rights to co-parent with this child? Again, even though that's a complete lie, and we just went over why that's a lie, are you really saying that just offing the child is the better way to do it? Well, if that's the case, then every child in Alabama or in the United States of America that has less than perfect parents needs to be executed. It's a ridiculous standard. And they're trying to drum up, oh, we're just the compassionate ones and we really care about these kids. Well, if you really care about the kids, then you don't want to kill the kids. Now, is it a bad thing? Was it a oversight by the state of Alabama that there was not a law like this already in place that automatically, even though the judges had discretion for it to do so already, that it automatically severed those rights? Yeah, and I'm glad that we have a law now that does that. But let's not act like this being in place was a massive travesty above the travesty of 60 million children losing their lives since Roe v. Wade. You can't tell me that the children's deaths, that's nothing. Let's not even worry about that. Oh, but the rapist having parental rights, that's okay. Again, both bad things, but let's look at an argument of degrees here. Let's look at which one is actually worse for the children. Being dead or a rapist having parental rights. Both horrible, but one's worse. And that's the point that I'm trying to make here. All right, we're going to go to a break here, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey y'all, I am on I-85 heading south, coming back from the loveliest village on the plains back to Montgomery. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I just got back from Auburn judging a parliamentary procedure contest. One of the things that it teaches young people is the art of debate. And because I was judging that and because I was thoroughly impressed with a lot of the kids that I saw today, it really made me appreciate it, made me think about what an integral part of being able to debate a topic is to a person's education. And it's the really intelligent young people that are able to engage in this contest. It's a very difficult contest. You don't even know what the subject is going to be until 1 minute before the contest starts. And so you have about 60 seconds to, in your mind, come up with 4 debates, whether this topic is a good idea or a bad idea, and you have to be able to think on your feet, and you have to be able to debate back and forth with your teammates. It's an incredibly difficult contest, even though, as a general rule, there aren't a lot of people that go through this contest that continue to use the rules of parliamentary procedure later in life. And I'm sure some do with their local churches or small organizations like that that actually use Robert's Rules of Order. Really what the contest teaches is the art of debate. You have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to very quickly come up with compelling arguments and to form your ideas and your thoughts about a topic into a coherent piece of thought and convey that to other people in such a way that it convinces them to side with you. And I was thinking about this, and this is a contest that you can't participate in until you get to at least the 9th grade. And it really made me sit down and think about how criminal it is that we don't teach our students debate much earlier. But there was a time where a staple of Western thought, that if you were an educated person in the West, you were started on debate at a very early age. In fact, it was not at all uncommon for somebody to be well-versed in the art of rhetoric, well-versed in the art of persuasive speech. From a very early age, it was one of the very first things that they taught. In ancient Greece, for example, going all the way back to the birth of Western civilization, they started you on that when you were about 5. They started you on geometry of all things and rhetoric. And the reason for that, the rationale for that, was that it was important because it taught you how to think critically. In other words, if you were involved in rhetoric and you had to learn how to put your thoughts together that quickly, and you had to challenge ideas and sometimes even take the opposite side of the position that you actually held on an issue, it taught you those really critical thinking skills. And because of that, the rest of your education was easier, because nothing teaches you a subject like having to defend it against attack, or the opposite, having to attack it and finding the places where the thinking is flawed or where the ideology needs some improvement. And so because of this, this was a staple of Western civilization really up until about 100 years ago. And it's part of the reason that the education system worked so well for so long. For the longest time, our students had to not only learn material, but had to stand up and defend it, or stand up and be critical of it. And that really helped them understand and absorb the material. And furthermore, because they started out with that first and developed their critical thinking skills, the rest of their education was more robust because they had those critical thinking skills and those problem-solving skills to begin with. So it made a real difference in our education system, and it's something that I believe is sorely lacking, something that we need to bring back. And another bit of social commentary on this is that when it comes to the stereotypical characteristics of some people in my generation and the generation after it, Generation Z, what do you typically think about? They have a hard time taking criticism. They don't like hearing ideas that are not shared by them. There are things that they say is actually violence or harmful to their health to hear ideas that they disagree with. Well, the reason that that wasn't the case for the longest part of Western civilization is because we took on the idea that you ought to have to defend your own ideas, that ideas ought to be observed critically, and that you should have to go through and test whether or not something was true or not. That's really not the way education works now. They give you facts that they say are true and then expect you to just sort of regurgitate them on the test. That's not an education. That's memorization. And there's nothing wrong with memorization. Memorization is great. I'm an advocate of it. But it's not the same as having to defend your ideas.
And welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us through the break. So, since we're starting to run out of time here, let's go ahead and go to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And for today's daily dose of stupid, we actually have a clip here done by a group called Self, who is running some ads on Facebook. So this is just something that went viral, and I wanted to go ahead and break it down for you. Here we go.
That we're not as capable as men, or we're not as fun to watch.
Female athletes need to stay in the kitchen. I cannot cook. I would probably burn a kitchen down. So you telling me to stay in the kitchen is not good.
If you don't love the WNBA, where you're seeing women play during the peaks of their career, you're just really full of hate of women.
Because we can't do what the men do, the game must be trash. And I guarantee you, all those people probably have never even seen us play.
There's a notion that female athletes in some way aren't putting in the same thing as like their male counterparts, that we aren't putting in, you know, the hours in the gym, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the injuries, the time away from our family and friends. It's a horrible misconception that people have about women.
As a female athlete in a sport, I've done triathlon and running, I have to wear things that are very revealing. A lot of times that can lead to others making comments about what our body type is. What should matter is our performance.
All right, so there it is. And, I mean, just so many things in there are blatantly absurd. First of all, and I've got to go to this comment first. The woman that was talking about the WNBA, and she's like, well, if you just don't like people playing in the NBA at the WNBA, watching women at the peaks of their careers, then you're just full of hate of women. What if the person doesn't like basketball? I don't watch the WNBA. I also don't watch the NBA. I watch college ball, but to be honest, I don't even really pay attention to that most of the time until March. Now, this time I did because Auburn was actually good. But when it comes to sports, it's not that somebody might have a ton of different reasons for not liking the WNBA. But another thing that's a big factor is they're just not as entertaining. Why? Because on average, women are shorter. And on average, they're less athletic than men. What was that? I saw an article not too long ago that a college girls team played like a scrimmage against a male high school team, and the boys still won. Look, the reason that people don't like female sports as much, or they don't find them as entertaining, is because there are certain things about the sport that they like. If you're a baseball fan, for example, you like seeing 97, 98 mile per hour pitches and big towering home runs. That doesn't really happen in women's softball. And to be honest, I like women's softball. I enjoy watching it. I used to do women's softball when I was over at Auburn, and that was before it was really popular. But nonetheless, I did that. That was part of the experience. And I have nothing against it, but I like baseball better because they're throwing faster and they're hitting further, and those are the things that are really exciting to see for a sports fan. When it comes to basketball, one of the things that people like about it is they like seeing those ESPN highlight reel plays where the guy jumps up on top of a couple of guys and then does a slam dunk. You don't see that much in the WNBA because they're shorter. It's a different game. There's different strategies involved, and they're just not as athletic. So the reason that people prefer the male versions of sports most of the time has nothing to do with the fact that they hate women. It has a lot more to do with the fact that there are just certain things about the sport that appeals to them and that they find entertaining, that they would rather watch that than they would the male version of the sport. And here's the thing, that's not even true in every single sport. There are a lot of sports where the female version is actually more popular. Women's gymnastics, for example, tends to get better ratings than men's gymnastics when it comes to the Olympics. You also have things like equestrian, which women tend to do better in. When you watch barrel racing, men do barrel racing, but typically the female version is something that we like more. We like watching female barrel racers. And personally, as somebody that attends rodeos, I like female barrel racing more than I like male barrel racing. Now, my favorite thing is the bull riding, but there's not really a male-female version of that. Actually, when it comes to sports, women have better ratings in the UFC. I don't know why necessarily people find that more entertaining, but the truth is I'm not a UFC fan, so I don't really have a fair way to compare here. But people like the female version of that one better. It's not because sports fans hate women or they don't care about women or they don't find it entertaining. It's just there are certain aspects of the sport that they find more entertaining when men are involved because men are more athletic on average. There are certain sports where the female version is more popular, and that's fine. But you need to be really cautious when attributing all of that to hate. It's not that men hate women. They just like certain aspects of the sports more when men are playing them. It's not the gender of the players, it's the results that are happening. It's the big home runs, it's the 9,700 mile per hour fastballs. That's the things that draw them, not the gender of the person playing the sport, and that's really the way that it should be. And to another thing that they talked about really quickly, this misconception that women aren't putting in nearly as much time or effort in the gym. Where are the people that have this misconception? I mean, I'm not saying there are none, but I've never heard it. I've been a sports fan my entire life, and I've never once heard anybody make the argument that they don't like women's sports as much, specifically because, they're not working nearly as hard at it. Never heard that. Not once. In fact, when it comes to just male sports, I've never heard anybody say that they disliked a player because they don't practice very often. You know who didn't practice very often? Bo Jackson. The reason being because during the offseason, he was playing a different sport. People still love Bo Jackson. It was not a deciding factor as to whether or not they like a certain player or a certain sport as much because of how much time the person spends in the gym. They care about what they see on the field, the product that is being put in front of them to entertain them. That's what sports fans care about. Period. Let's go to the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today comes from the book of Daniel. We're going to be continuing along those lines. So in the book of Daniel, just to give you a little bit of context, if you haven't been watching the previous installments of the Chaplain's Report on this, Daniel is giving a prayer about the plight of Israel and where they are. And he continues that in Daniel 9 through 11. To the Lord our God belong compassion and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. Nor have we obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his teaching, which he set before us through his servants the prophets. Indeed, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, not obeying your voice. So the curse has been poured out on us, along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, for we have sinned against him. Now, this verse just continues on the theme that we've already talked about how Daniel really recognizes that the reason that Israel is in the state that it's in, the reason that it is no longer in the nation of Israel, that their people have been taken away, that the Persians and the Medes and the Babylonians have taken them away from their homeland, is because of things that they've done. Is because of the evil that they have done before the Lord, that they have not obeyed his voice, they have not kept his commandments, they have not stayed true to the covenant that they had with God. That's the bigger overarching theme, but I want to specifically look at something that he mentions here. That right in the middle of the verse, or the middle of the passage that we read, he says that not only have we rebelled against him, but God sent them the prophets, his teachings which he set before us through his servants the prophets. Now this is something that we see pretty frequently mentioned by Jesus Christ as well, several hundred years later in the time of the Roman occupation, is that even though God continuously sent prophets to Israel, he was always sending them messengers, always saying, hey, here I am, this is what you need to do, this is what you did wrong, this is how to correct it. This was a common occurrence, a common theme that continued through the Bible. And yet, when it came to that, every single time, God sends them the prophets, and most of the time they didn't listen. There are a handful of exceptions, but most of the time, not only did they not listen, they actually attacked the prophets. Many prophets died at the hands of people that didn't like them. Unfortunately, this happened a lot. The people died simply for doing what God told them to do. That they died simply for carrying that message and carrying the water for God and telling Israel, look, you're not living right. They didn't like the message, so they killed the messenger. As if that would change anything. And then they wondered why they got stuck in situations like this where Israel was in captivity for their rebellion, where they were taken away from their promised land. You see, unfortunately, this is a cycle that really should resonate with us as well. That there are people that have ample opportunity, that God constantly sends them messenger after messenger after messenger after messenger, pleading with them, please repent, please turn away from these things, because if you don't, bad things are going to happen to you. If that happens, if that takes place, you are going to fall prey to the consequences of your own decisions. And God is constantly sending messengers to them and constantly sending them signs. And they just say, no thanks. Not interested. And thankfully, sometimes when that happens, sometimes when people continue to ignore God and then they hit rock bottom, sometimes then people realize, wow, that was a bad idea. And then they come back to where they're supposed to be. They come back to a place where they are honoring God and doing what He wants them to do, and they cease their rebellion. But just like Israel, most of the time in our personal lives, we don't do that. Most of the time, we ignore the prophets, we ignore the signpost, and then we hit rock bottom. And then even at that point, most people, they still don't see it. And that's really the case that Daniel is trying to make here. He's saying Israel needs to repent. God's not the reason that we're in this mess. We are. And so he's trying to set this up and to explain to them, he's like, guys, we had every opportunity. God sent prophets to us constantly. We had the law of Moses, we had the Torah, we had the covenant, we had the promised land, we had prosperity, we had victory over our enemies. We had everything going for us. And yet we still refuse to do what God asked us to do. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like modern day America to a lot of you? Doesn't that sound like what we're going through right now? That here in the United States of America, we've got everything going for us. We have religious freedom. We have freedom of speech. We have churches all over the place. We're a majority Christian nation. We've got all the wealth that we could ask for. We're wealthier than any other country in the history of the human race. And yet, even though we're seeing all these signposts, all these warnings, hey, knock it off, don't go any further, we've got the Bible ready at our fingertips for free. We don't even have to pay for Bibles anymore because you can get it on an app on your phone. We've got all these massive advantages that no people in the history of mankind has ever had. And there's still so many people going, no thanks. Don't really want to do that. And all the warning signs are there, and sadly, most people just don't pay attention to it. I think that there's a kinship here that we can really recognize between us and Daniel. That if we are living the right way, if we are trying to obey God and trying to do the right thing, that just like Daniel was observing here in his prayer, there's so many people that just don't see it. There are so many people that walk through life basically asleep to the spiritual reality surrounding them. That they are in open rebellion to God and they don't even understand that they are. Or if they are, they relish in it and don't want to quit. But the thing is, even though Daniel was praying for them and praying that they would see the error of their ways, most of them still never happened for them. But there were some that did. And even though the vast majority didn't, the some that did, the some that listened to Daniel, the some that listened to the other prophets, they were worth it. They were worth God sending them into danger, sometimes to lose their own life, to try to bring people this message of God loves you and He wants what's best for you. Please listen to Him and obey His laws. And that's the message that we should be sending to people still today. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ.